Welcome to Khanversations. I'm Muqtedar, your host, and today I'm going to talk about this trip that China's President Xi Jinping is making to Europe. He's visiting France. He's going to have a tete-a-tete with Macron, the president of France, and then after his visit to Paris, he's going to visit Serbia and Hungary. This is an important visit. I think this is his visit after 5 years to France. And there are several things that Xi is trying to accomplish in this trip. Number one, I think he is going to try and impede the beginning of a major trade war between European Union and China. And the number two, he's trying to exercise his own and encourage France to exercise its strategic autonomy, especially from the United States. So before we get into the details, do subscribe to Khanversations, like this video, press the bell icon, and don't forget to share it with others. So the environment right now is quite hostile. Europe is talking about de-risking or even deglobalization. They are talking about shifting manufacturing completely out of China. China on the other hand, is pressing back, is subsidizing its essentially green technology and industry, and creating circumstances which Europeans call as unfair trade practices by subsidizing its green companies, which is making European and American companies less and less competitive in the marketplace. So there is a threat of imposing tariffs and customs on Chinese goods, especially on electronic vehicles. So I think that in a couple of weeks, the tariffs will already be in place in Europe and all across Europe by November. The talk is that either 15 to 30% over Chinese electric vehicles coming into Europe, and that's going to create a huge problem for the Chinese exporters. And in return, if China were to retaliate, for example, China is considering imposing tariffs on French brandy and French wine, and that is the biggest item that is imported from France in China. So basically, Xi is here to discourage France and European Union from going forward with essentially tariffs on China, which will compel him to respond, and this could basically trigger a trade war. As you can see, European Union used to be China's number one trading partner. Now it has become number two. Southeast Asia has become number one Chinese trading partner, and the United States is number three. With just these three, with Europe, East Asia, and the US, China's exports exceed over $2.5 trillion. That's one thing. But the second thing is that he's also going to visit Serbia and Hungary. And this is a much more interesting thing because Hungary is like the Chinese agent inside the European Union. On numerous occasions, Hungary has vetoed European Union's actions against China. And so in many ways, is China's best friend in Europe now. So there are two things that Xi is hoping to accomplish. One is to convince Macron to be strategically autonomous of the United States and so pursue a non-Cold War-like approach to China, basically not follow in the US footsteps, which is putting a lot of pressure on China economically, strategically, geopolitically. And the second thing that he would like to do is essentially to actually increase trade and do that. So to understand this very clearly, the battle now is in the high-tech green energy area, electric vehicles, lithium batteries, solar cells. So all of this green technology is the challenge, and both Europeans and the United States feel that that China is subsidizing its companies, and by doing that, it has created an overcapacity. And so China is dumping these goods and these electric vehicles, not just in Europe, it hasn't reached the US yet, but all over the world. The solar cells are here, the batteries are here, and it is becoming increasingly difficult for Americans and Europeans to compete with China in this particular arena. And this is the future. This is the future. So China is beginning to already dominate the future. China is also threatening to cut off exports to Europe, especially to France, of things that go into the electric vehicles. If Europe were to impose some kind of tariffs on China and create trade barriers to Chinese imports. But the most important thing that China is doing, which I don't know how Europe is going to counterbalance that, is by investing. So the Chinese electric vehicle BYD is going to invest heavily in Hungary, and so Chinese electric vehicles will now be manufactured in Hungary. So even if there is some kind of customs regime that prevents Chinese companies coming from outside Europe, Chinese exports from Hungary will be just internal to European Union. So Xi is visiting Serbia, which is, even though not yet fully part of European Union, it enjoys a free trade agreement with European Union. So things that are manufactured in Serbia and Hungary can easily be exportable to the rest of the European Union, skirting the sanctions, or not sanctions, but tariffs that European Union might impose on China. So in that sense, China could have its cake and eat it too. So to put it this way, China subsidizes its companies and basically creates an unfair balance of, shall we say, competitiveness in favor of its companies. Europe retaliates by imposing tariffs, but China is inside European Union through Hungary and Serbia, and so those tariffs do not really affect it. But it also gives China the justification to impose tariffs on European goods, and so China becomes more protectionist, and therefore European cars and European other products, even if they come into China, will be expensive, and so already China enjoys about $300 billion of trade advantage. European exports to China are $300 billion less than Europe's imports from China. The total trade is around $800 billion. So that is what she's trying to accomplish. Now, what is interesting is that more than China, we know what China really wants to do. China wants to create a cleavage inside Europe. So those countries which are being aggressively anti-China are balanced by countries that are pro-China. So right now, basically, it's not just Hungary and Serbia, but most of the Balkans region. China is heavily invested there. It's also heavily invested in Portugal. So basically, it's trying to divide Europe as that which is worried about China and that part of Europe which is not worried about China, rather is aligned with China. The second thing that China wishes to do is to create a divide between Europe and the US. So it wants France and other European countries to be, quote unquote, strategically autonomous, which means they do not follow what the US is doing with regards to China, with regards to Taiwan, etc. Another interesting thing is that commentators are expecting that the dialogue in France will be a bit more aggressive, where Macron is going to put pressure on China to open China's markets and try to level the playing field and remove what Europeans feel are unfair trade practices. We will see what happens if China takes the lead on imposing tariffs on Chinese goods. Then it might ruin the relationship. But more or less, China and France have been quite friendly for the past few years. If you remember, Macron recently visited China and he was treated very well. But still, Macron is expected to be very tough with Xi with regards to China's support for Russia. We'll see what happens. I don't think that China is going to budge on its trade relations with Russia. There's a lot of talk that one of the reasons why Xi is going to Serbia is basically to talk about the United States bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and to remind the Europeans as to how the United States tends to be aggressive and remind them about NATO's accession. So I think the conversation is going to be in that way. Macron is going to do enough to avoid criticism from pro-Ukrainian Europeans, pro-Ukrainian countries like England and others, and the US. But I think Macron's main focus is going to be on trying to increase French exports to China, and also to make sure, I mean, this is what I find very interesting about Western leaders. They like to say that, look, we will impose sanctions on you, but you should not impose sanctions on us. We will import tariffs on you, but you should not impose on it. So while the European Union will perhaps go ahead with trying to impose some kind of a customs duty on Chinese cars, France will try to talk China and Xi into not reciprocating on the goods that it exports. As far as Chinese investments are concerned, with regards to these two countries, Hungary and Serbia, there's a lot of talk about future investments. So far, only $30 billion have been invested, I think, part of the Belt and Road Initiative. But the biggest thing is this fast train from Budapest to Belgrade, which is kind of the shining investment, I guess, of Chinese presence in Eastern and Central Europe. Some of the countries which are very anti-Russia are also not very happy with China. Countries like Poland, for example, which are on the border with Russia. So to work for Xi Jinping is cut out. What I don't understand is why Xi is not going to Germany. Olaf Scholz was in China very recently, so he could be reciprocating this. A custom on Chinese-made vehicles coming into Europe will also hurt Germany. So, for example, apparently 50% of all profits of Volkswagen come from those that are manufactured in China and sold in Europe. So most of the electric vehicles, I think the German cars are manufactured now in China, and then they are brought and sold in Europe. So if there are tariffs on cars coming from China into Europe, it will not be just on Chinese companies, but it will also be on German companies. So I think that is probably to China's advantage, because I don't think Germany will allow the European Union to go ahead with imposing a major tariff on Chinese-made cars, because it would hurt German automobile industry too. So this is the more interesting aspect of it as to why Xi Jinping is not going to Germany. These visits are very important because France is trying its best to do 2 or 3 things. They are preparing, or at least Macron wants to prepare Europe to become something like a nation state, a much more integrated unit than it is at the moment. So he wants to have a border for European Union, like you have for countries. He's talking about sovereignty of European Union. And therefore, with sovereignty comes autonomy. And Europe cannot truly be autonomous if it is not able to defend itself. So he is thinking of a EU which is like a state, which is strong, which has its own defense industry. If you go back and listen to or read about his speech that he gave at Sorbonne, it is very clear that he's afraid that Europe is going to be essentially trampled in the geopolitical and economic competition between China and the US. So he wants Europe to stand up and become a major power. He wants to make Europe great again. I think that is the goal of France. And this is also an opportunity for a country like India to get into the fray. Unfortunately, the free trade agreement that India was negotiating with Europe hasn't come through. It has managed with countries which are not part of the European Union, such as Ireland and Iceland, Switzerland. But otherwise, this is also an important, especially if Europe wants to be autonomous, independent basically of the United States, then it has to play ball with India and China. And somehow come to terms with Russia. It will have to bring about peace. But as long as it's afraid of Russia, wants to compete with China, and not get too friendly with India, then it has no choice but to remain essentially a poodle of the United States. There is another interesting development that I wanted to touch upon in the context of this relationship between France, between Europe and China. So the European Union maintains a position, and let me just pull up exactly what they say about their stated doctrinal position towards China. So their official doctrinal position of the European Union, all 27 member countries, is they describe China as a partner for cooperation, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. So the systemic rival is China's challenge to the liberal order that Europe subscribes to. So it's a geopolitical, global, systemic, normative model that China wants a different kind of a world order. And therefore, Europe, like the United States, sees it as a systemic rival. They see it as an economic competitor and then a partner for cooperation. So if they're not cooperating on economic issues, what are they cooperating on? I guess this is about dealing with immigrations, terrorism, or perhaps also with regards to environmental issues, combating global tragedies, etc. But the Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, described this European position in a very funny way. He said, this whole idea that you are a partner, competitor, and rival, it's like saying you are coming to a signal and you are seeing all three lights on, red, orange, and green. So what are you going to do? Are you going to drive or are you not? So it's going to cause more confusion. So the Chinese position is that the European position is very confusing because they have to make up their mind. What China really wants to do is essentially eliminate Europe as a systemic rival, and even as a competitor, and just be a trade partner, allowing China to export billions and trillions of dollars worth of goods to Europe, and if possible, take advantage of European technology, and essentially isolate the United States, with whom China definitely sees as a major geopolitical rival. So I think that's what I'm not sure whether she's going to achieve anything at all in this trip. This is also a good opportunity for him to essentially try and soften all the anti-China rhetoric that is coming from the West. So if it reduces talk of de-risking, deglobalization, etc., and sends some kind of signal to businesses in the West that this is not the time to divest from China. That is his goal. But already the message is across. So you can see more and more companies are trying to invest in other countries, such as Vietnam, Mexico, India, Malaysia, Indonesia. So the foreign direct investments, as I've shown in the previous conversations when I did, have dropped significantly. I think in 2022, there were about $300 billion that were invested in China. And last year, it was only $30 billion. So there was roughly a 90% drop in foreign direct investments in China. So we'll continue to keep an eye on what Xi Jinping is doing in Paris and then especially in Hungary. Hungary is considered as a pariah in Europe, even though it's part of the European Union. So it is quite possible that Hungary might become the outpost, the Russian and the Chinese outpost inside Europe. So I'm going to leave you with these thoughts, and we'll continue the conversations because I guess for the next, in our lifetime, we will be talking about US, China, US, Europe. I think the most important relationships in the world today from a geopolitical perspective, number one is US-Europe relations. Number two is US-China relations, or you could reverse the two. The third is Europe-China. The fourth is India-US. Fifth is India-China relations. Unfortunately, there's not much on the diplomatic front between India and China. And because of India's elections and recent developments, the diplomatic front on India and the West is also calmed down a little bit. it is quite possible that after India's election and India's Prime Minister attends the G7 summit in June, I think, in Italy, we will see more diplomatic developments. So we will keep track of these things, and until then. So please, if you haven't subscribed to Khanversations, do subscribe to Khanversations, like this video, press the bell icon. And until next time, I'm your host, Muqtedar Khan. Take care.